good afternoon, good evening from whichever part of the world you're connecting for this webinar on value thinking in procurement. My name is Manish Shanberg. I'm from EIPM, the European Institute of Purchasing Management. And in the next 45 minutes or an hour or so, we are going to go through some of the key aspects of value thinking in procurement. Okay, so what we can do is just wait for a minute or so because I can see that people are connecting. Okay. Meanwhile, just some logistics information for you. Okay. So here, if you have any questions or if you have any comments to make during the chat, during the webinar, you can use the chat function. Okay, there's a chat function. And we have my colleague Silmara is also present in this call. She will be moderating, and she will, if you have any technical issues as well, she can respond to you, and she does that very quickly. Okay, so you can use that chat function to, if you have any audio issues or some kind of technical issues. And it also at the same time, if you have any questions or comments to make, we'll take that. Okay, if you have any questions, typically what I do is if there is a logical pause at a certain point of time, I take that question, or we take it towards the end as well. Okay. Other important thing is you will receive a link for the video replay of this session. So you can see the entire presentation, including what I'm saying now. Okay, you'll receive that link. And also you'll receive a copy of the presentation. There are a couple of polls that are included in the presentation. So you'll receive a copy of the presentation, which includes the results of the poll that you will have, okay? Or the survey that you will have. So these are just some logistics info. At the end of the webinar, you will also get a quick feedback survey. So I request you to fill this. It will take probably 30 seconds of your time. But it is very useful for us to make any improvements. If you have any comments or if you want to look at some specific topics that you want to look into further, in the next webinars, you could mention that in the comment section. Okay, this is about the logistics part. Okay, I'll just look. I think quite a few people are now connecting. So I'm just looking at the list of people who have connected. So largely a lot of people from the Americas. Yeah, we see from US, Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, also some people from Europe as well. Yeah, but it's largely the Americas in terms of the industry. Also, we have quite a few people from manufacturing industry as well, some services industries and so on. So we have a good mix of, let's say, geography, some in Europe, mostly in Americas, and then a good mix of industry as well. Okay, that's great. Good. All right, so what we're going to do in the next 45 minutes to 1 hour or so is we're going to look at the agenda is what is value, how do we define value, procurement contribution and impact that it creates, largely on when I talk about impact, it's going to be impact largely on the financial aspect of the company. We're going to look at some examples of upstream and downstream contributions of procurement, and finally some of the non-financial value add. Yeah, this is also becoming more and more visible in many companies. So some of the non-financial value add that you could do as procurement. Okay, and then we'll just wrap up through a summary. Okay, but before that, just in terms of the evolution of procurement from, the idea is procurement has evolved over, as a function, has evolved over a period of time from a largely PO placing department kind of a perception, so even today in some companies, there's engineering, there's a requester, sometimes they come and say, okay, here, procurement, place a PO for me. The supplier has decided, the price also may be decided, and so on and so forth. And procurement is doing a more transactional work. Yeah. So from there, and then there's the other extreme where procurement is one of the core contributors in the entire ecosystem. Today we have the automotive world where we have many companies working together as part of the ecosystem, and procurement is a significant contributor in the strategy making as well. So you can see this big, let's say, a big difference of how procurement is working and is perceived from a purely PO placing, very transactional department to a very strategic department which contributes to the strategic goals of the company, right? So the idea here is to look at different avenues or different ways in which procurement can add value to the company, yeah, even if it is something to do at the transaction level, as against when it moves higher up in the value chain, working and contributing to the ecosystem. So we're going to look at some examples across all these areas. Okay. Good. So let's start with a quick survey. I'm just going to ask you one question in terms of the first point of the agenda as value. Yeah, what is value according to you? And you have some choices. So obviously there's no right or wrong answer as such. It's just to get your feedback on how you perceive value, especially when it is related to procurement. Okay. So I'm just going to launch this quick survey here. Okay. All right, so you will see, so what according to you is the definition of value created by procurement? So you can see some choices. You can select multiple, so 1, 2, or 3. And don't forget to click on submit so that I get your answers registered. Okay, so just to read out, what is value? Provide the service at cheapest price, best quality, satisfaction at lowest cost, risk protection, and then stable relationships. Some options. Yeah, these are just some of the options. All right, good. So I'm getting some answers now. Great. Give you a few minutes. A few seconds rather, not a few minutes. Sorry. Don't forget to click on submit. All right, the answers are ticking in. Okay, last 15 seconds. It's multiple choice, huh? So you can choose multiple answers. Huh? Okay, 5, 4. I'm going to end the voting in a few seconds. Please click on submit. I'm going to share the results as well with you. All right. Okay, I'm going to end it now. Up, done. Okay, now I'm going to share the results. So here, you can see the results of what people have chosen for on this call. So it's a decent sample across geographies, across industries. But what you can see, what do you think in terms of value created by procurement? So a lot of, I mean, a majority of you believe that it's best satisfaction at lowest cost, which is one of the best answers that you could get across this. There's no right or wrong answer here, as I said. I mean, largely everything is tending towards the right answer, and the degrees are varying, obviously. Yeah. But here you can see that providing the best satisfaction at lowest cost to your internal and final customer is something which is very key. And you recognize that providing a stable relationship with all your suppliers as well as an internal client is also one of the key elements, aside from obviously the price, aside from the quality that you look, and risk protection as well. So in the morning, we had this session as well, and there was a slight difference. I was just looking at the result from what we had. But again, the best answer that came up was still satisfaction at the lowest cost. So you got the flow effectively right. Yeah. So let's go back and look at what is the definition of value that you said. Okay. So obviously what you said is right. So it's a function of satisfaction versus versus cost. Okay, it's a function of satisfaction versus cost. So we talk about value as in V here is a function of satisfaction. We have that small emoji and then a smiley, and then we have the dollar sign, which is the cost. So obviously the idea here is if you want to increase value purely in terms of mathematical possibilities, you either decrease the denominator or increase the numerator. Okay, so When we talk about decreasing the denominator, and that's where procurement over many, many years has been perceived and judged. Decreasing the denominator, savings, cost, savings. This is where procurement has been perceived and judged since many years. Okay, where we have been, I mean, as a department, we have been seen as a department which saves as a function which saves money for the company, reduces costs, and thus increases value. But there are different avenues to still add value. Okay, you could increase the numerator, you could provide different levels of satisfaction across a variety of parameters for your stakeholders. Okay, so at the same cost, you could keep the same cost and provide something additional to the stakeholder that is still adding value. If you do both at the same time, increase the value and decrease the cost, then it's fantastic. Then you're a star in your company. Okay, if you can do both. It's a bit challenging for sure, but still it's possible. You could do that. Or the other option is also in terms of the volume that you put. So even if you increase the cost to a certain extent, but you get a much larger benefit on the top, you still add value. Okay, so when we look at value creation, or what about what does procurement think about adding value, there are various avenues, and this is what we are going to explore on the different avenues of keeping this basic equation in mind. What are the different areas in which we can think about adding value? Yeah, in terms of contribution to reducing the denominator, which is cost largely, and contributing to increasing the satisfaction to the customer. Okay, and here you have what I call them as procurement rights, so to say, is this is what is expected. So procurement has to provide the right product or service at the right place, at the right price, at the right time, with the right quality, and the right quantity. Okay, this is what is typically expected from procurement. Of course, it is matured beyond. Sometimes you have, as you already identified, the relationship with the supplier as a key element of value add, the risk management as a key element of value add. So all this has been recent, not recent, but developments over the past few years, and that is already helping procurement to move from, as I said before, a PO placing kind of a department to more of a value add and a strategy contributor in the ecosystem. Okay, so you can see that within these different rights that we have, you could still add on to a lot of value, not only on cost and savings, but also to a lot of parameters in the numerator, which will give satisfaction to the customer. Okay, right. So let's see, whenever you do any kind of an action, right, even at the denominator or at the numerator, how is it contributing to the company's bottom line? Because ultimately what is still being seen largely across the world is people are looking at the bottom line, right, of the company. So let me just go there. And as a very classic case, I've just taken a very small, let's say, sample of an income statement or a profit or loss statement, where we have the bottom line, which is the net income, yeah, and just given some basic elements. Okay, you don't need to go through that, but just look at the basic elements of a typical income statement. Okay, and let's work bottom up. Let's look at it bottom up way. Okay, so largely speaking, you have the income tax. Okay, when you work bottom up, you have the income tax. Can procurement do something about it? Well, it's difficult, it's challenging, because it is largely linked to the geography of where your company is placed, the region, etc. It has a certain tax structure. The country has a tax structure. It's more of a finance game, effectively, on the benefits that you can get here. So not much that procurement can do. If we work upwards, you have the financial income and expenses, right? In the financial income and expenses, again, it's depending on how the financial structure of the company, how much is debt, how much is equity, how much of interest you pay, etc., etc. Okay, so that's also more of a finance tool, let's say. So not much procurement can do here. Typically, what we are looking in terms of contribution is on those two main elements of cost of sales, okay, or cost of goods sold, and the operating expenses, OPEX, operating expenses, where you have procurement direct direct procurement contribution on the cost of sales. So it could be material and labor largely. Okay, there are other elements also, but largely material and labor. And when we talk about, so these are directly linked to your performance of getting better benefits from your suppliers. And then there are some indirect cost reductions that you do. Let's say you have an action plan on reducing the travel expenses of the company, okay, or optimizing the facility management. There are many initiatives like this, or optimizing or reducing IT expenses within the company, etc., etc. Okay, so you have these contribution that you can do, which is then seen as a procurement contribution. Okay, and as you can see, the contribution is largely on the gross margin when you work on the cost of goods sold, and largely on the income, operating income, or the EBIT, yeah, earnings before interest and taxes, or the operating income, practically the same in many companies. Okay, so you have this contribution. Now the idea is to think, what else can I do? How can procurement be even a sales enabler? How can you work with suppliers? Maybe if you come up with a fantastic innovation with a supplier, can it be a sales enabler, especially if the innovation is giving you a first movers advantage, or an advantage of time to market, let's say. Okay, so that's where you start moving into a bit more of value addition than just purely savings and cost related aspects. Okay, so whatever action plan that you're doing, the idea is to look at, how am I contributing to my cost of sales or cost of goods sold? How am I contributing to my operating income? Can I contribute even to the sales or a top line? Now, once you get the savings, how it is treated is maybe beyond the control of procurement. It's mostly the finance. So if you have a large savings, will these savings be used and put back into the system to generate more sales, spend somewhere else, or are they reflected on the bottom line? That's a different question. Okay, but largely speaking, procurement can already see, and as you know, in some companies, I come from a manufacturing background, where you have the cost of sales is roughly 60 to 65% of revenues. So you can see that there's a huge impact that procurement can have there, and that's why more and more organizations have moved from being just a savings department to a boardroom contributor, simply given the volume of contribution that you can do to the bottom line of the company. Okay. Right. So this is just to give you an idea of whatever action plan you do, how it is linked to the bottom line. Then let's move. Let's look at some of the contributions that you could do. Yeah, and we now split these contribution into something what we call upstream and something what we call downstream. Okay. So on the x-axis here, you can see the timeline of any project for that matter. Okay, a timeline. It could be any project or a serialized production, or whichever context you consider. And on the y-axis, we have the cost element. Okay, so typically in a project, you have initially the needs definition or the conceptualization and so on and so forth, what we call upstream. And then there's a setup phase, and then a more execution phase, yeah, or the production phase. Okay, so let's look at the blue dotted line first. Okay, here you have the blue dotted line, which is the cost generated by decisions, whatever decisions you take upstream. Let's say or of a particular technology or of a particular material that goes into the formation of the product, etc., etc. So that cost is decided upfront. Okay, and later on it plateaus up. It plateaus out because all the costs are generated by the decisions that you take. Then if you look at the expenses line, which is the orange line here, the expenses are typically increasing when you are putting this product in a serialized production or in a more execution phase, where initially the expenses are low, maybe just for prototypes and so on and so forth, and then they increase as you move into production. Okay, so these are two elements. And now the third one, which is the most important one here in terms of the potential savings that can be got in a project. So you can see very clearly that in the upstream part of the project, you have a huge potential of savings, of cost savings. Okay, which now we are talking about the contribution to the bottom line clearly, to the denominator. Yeah, very clearly. Here you have a huge potential of savings upstream. Okay, as you move downstream, as the project progresses, you move downstream, the savings potential reduces exponentially almost. Yeah, so just to give you a very simple example, and we will talk about these example a little bit more in detail when we look at one of the functional specifications. But if you work on, let's say, negotiation, yeah, which is one of the basic tools that a procurement professional has, negotiating with suppliers, yeah, you already have started moving towards the downstream where the potential of savings can be slightly lesser. Yeah, so today you negotiate with your suppliers, you get 5% savings, 3% savings the following year, 2%, then 1%, and so on and so forth. Effectively, the savings potential is quite limited. Yeah, in purely if you take a lever like negotiation to get savings, right? So to put it very crudely, it could be said that you're basically fighting for peanuts. Yeah, you could have still benefits coming out of it, but the bigger chunks would be got, the bigger savings would be got when you start moving upstream. And that's where we start looking at the different avenues of value that procurement can give in, aside from contributing to the denominator. Okay, and we'll look at some examples of upstream contribution as well as downstream contributions. Okay, good. So moving on, here we look at some of the upstream and downstream contributions. Okay, so in the upstream contributions, as we saw before, managing stakeholder expectations, so the early engagement of procurement, yeah, that it could have. Then we look at functional specification. Okay, functional specification is one of the, let's say, key levers of upstream contribution, or challenging the product or challenging the service features of the product. And we'll take one example in the next slide after this. Value engineering is again a way to add value upstream as well, adjusting the need to market. Today, procurement is at a frontier of the external supply base, right? So a lot of the times, and I've seen this myself as well, a lot of the times, there could be the engineering department, or the requester, whoever is the requester, they come to procurement and say, hey, we need to buy this. That's it. Yeah, we need to buy this. Everything is already decided, and that comes to procurement to work on the operational side of getting the RFPs, RFQs, selection of suppliers, etc., etc. Right? But what we are as procurement, we are at a good position to understand what is there in the external world, and this is what you mentioned as well in terms of getting innovation from the supplier. Yeah, what is there in the external world, and then adjusting the need itself to the market. There could be certain standardized products that are available rather than being heavily customized from the internal perspective. So you could adjust that need to the external market, and that gives certainly a much higher contribution than purely on a negotiation or a cost breakdown aspect. Okay. The outside-in view of innovation. This is again similar to what I said, where we get an innovation from a supplier, plug it onto our ecosystem, and then get the product out, or the service, whichever way, whichever case you're handling, right? An outside-in view of innovation. And today, in fact, a lot of the innovation is coming from procurement. Very classically speaking, we had the R&D department, the research and development department, which was a key department for innovation. And over a period of time, more and more contributions are coming from procurement, where the supplier is obviously one of the drivers, and the procurement is catching this innovation at the right time and then bringing it on inside the company to get those benefits. Okay, so these are all upstream contributions that we can see. Then there are some others which are more technical, or as monetizing the risk. This is also a very, very critical contribution from procurement. And you mentioned that in the risk, as one of the key elements in the poll. Once we have risk, many companies today, they have the risk matrix and risk mitigation plans and so on and so forth, where you have a risk identified and then you provide a mitigation plan to the risk. What you could go beyond is how to monetize that risk, yeah, how to dollarize or let's say euroize that risk, whichever currency, effectively to place money against it, because then immediately the stakeholders start listening. Yeah, rather than saying this is a risk and this is a plan. Okay, so what? So that could be the question. The idea here is to say this much is the amount at stake, and hence this action plan, and hence a certain amount of budget which is necessary, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so we are monetizing that risk to give a larger impact to the stakeholders. Okay, and then there are some other technical tools like value engineering or some redesign to cost tools, should costing, DFX or design to TCO, design for assembly, design for after sales, etc., etc. Okay, so we can see all these are upstream contributors, and we talk about upstream contributors. From this graph, you can see that they have a biggest contribution in terms of savings. Okay, the other thing which I just quickly mentioned, which I didn't mention before, is today in companies we have a big tracking, let's say, on cost reduction. And unfortunately, we don't have too much of a track on cost avoidance. I've seen with all my, clients that I work with, some clients I have started to track cost avoidance, but many of them don't have cost avoidance. So it's not a big, let's say, a trigger for procurement to work. But more and more companies are doing it now to track cost avoidance upstream. So that gives a good lever for procurement to showcase that today we are not only on cost reduction mode, we are moving towards cost avoidance as well, where we are contributing to the numerator as well as denominator at the same time to give value ultimately to the end customer. Okay, so this is also being treated. So this is on the upstream side. On the downstream side, you have certain levers again that procurement can work with. Is very simply put, reduce time in selection of suppliers. Yeah. So if you look at the actions that we have mentioned here, none of the actions talk about purely savings. Okay, so because I consider savings as a default expectation from procurement, procurement has to do savings. So other than that, these are some of the elements that I mentioned. So reducing time in selection of suppliers could be a absolute key contributor in terms of value. Yeah, where one example was one of my colleagues was working with a person where we had the RFQ process, which took around 8 to 9 months. Yeah, and together there was a process put in place as a pilot in one company where it was linked to the second part being agile, and the time to right from the conception to the selection of suppliers, including the RFQ process, was reduced from 8 to 9 months to 6 weeks. Yeah, so it's less than 2 months. And that gives a lot of advantage, especially given the nature of the product. If you have a product which is very, very important for time to market, yeah, and then you gain all that time also, gain all that effort also. Yeah, so you can see a lot of benefits that come just by, and this is all downstream contribution. Yeah, even though we're not talking about internal, let's say, internal dynamics, internal stakeholder communication. This is all about getting benefits from downstream purely. Okay, being agile or cutting red tapes in approvals is another example. Just processing faster, processing PO, processing the invoices, etc., etc. Just processing them faster can also give you a lot of benefits. Negotiating payment terms obviously is one of the key elements, but also at the same time to show the cash flow impact. Whenever you make these negotiations with your suppliers, the idea is to show a cash flow impact of negotiating the right kind of payment terms with the suppliers. Reducing the transaction costs, yeah, obviously with your suppliers, again reducing the transaction cost. Also working towards efficient contract deployment. Okay, so when I talk about efficient contract deployment, one of the key things is, as procurement, you could sign fantastic contracts with your suppliers, but imagine if they're not deployed well. Yeah, you could still have companies working with some of the local contracts or some of the contracts with where the pricing is very different from what you decided in this good contract that you have signed. There could be maverick buying, etc., etc. Okay, so these are all downstream, let's say, levers that you could use ultimately to add value. Okay, and as you can see now, you will get a flow of it. As you can see, we are starting to move towards some of the non-financial value add. Okay, some of the non-financial value add, because not each of these contributions can be quickly monetized. The benefits may not be monetized. Let's say negotiating payment terms, yes, they can immediately shown in terms of cash flow impact. Reduction in selection of time of suppliers. It's a bit challenging to monetize this. If you reduce the time of selection of suppliers from 6 months to 3 months, what are all the benefits that you will get from those additional 3 months? It can still, everything could be still monetized, but it's a bit challenging. Again, cutting red tapes, how much time you reduce, deploying contracts efficiently, again, giving you all these, let's say, non-financial value add to procurement eventually. Okay, so given these examples here, we're going to look at one example a bit more in detail about functional specs. Okay, and then we'll look at some of the downstream elements as well. So in terms of functional specs, this is just one example that we have taken to explain the value thinking in terms of functional specs. It is also closely linked to value analysis, okay, but we'll still consider that as a more upstream contribution with a functional spec approach. Okay, so purely speaking, if we look at a product or a service, okay, we'll look at two views. One is a customer's point of view, where you have a product or a service has various functions of unequal importance. Okay, we are ranking these functions on the left-hand side of the screen. We are ranking these functions in terms of importance. So here you can see function 1 is the most important, function 6 is the second, 5, 4, 2, and 3 in terms of the ranking. However, if you look at a purely manufacturer's point of view, okay, a product service is made of components, or let's say purely of raw material and labor components. We just consider these two big chunks, raw material and labor, and there's a cost hierarchy to it. Okay, so when we talk about now, link it to the upstream contribution in procurement. Imagine, as I said before, somebody comes to you and gives you, here is the specs, here is the need, here is everything, go and buy. Okay, and this is the instruction given to procurement. The very notion of functional specs is to understand what are all the functions which are there or expected from this product or service that you want to buy, and what is the cost hierarchy associated with it. Okay, a lot of the times procurement receives technical specifications, not much of functional specifications. Okay, so here we are trying to challenge the internal stakeholder upstream in the project itself as to convert these technical specs into functional specs and then look at the cost hierarchy associated with it. So in this given example, you have a function F1, okay, here function F1 with a cost hierarchy where function F1 in terms of cost hierarchy is slightly lower, okay, in terms of the hierarchy. Whereas you have function 2 and function 3, which are the highest cost contributors. But if you look at the customer's perspective, they are ranked extremely low in terms of importance for the customer. Yeah. So you need to start then wondering, why am I spending so much in terms of the cost to get a function which is not so important to the customer? Okay, so of course you need to do the analysis, but it's just that the very notion to challenge. Yeah, maybe there could be regulatory reasons. Yeah, just as an example, I'm thinking aloud. Maybe there's a regulatory reason to include these functions, which is an absolute must for your product to be in the market. Yeah, then it's certainly adding value. Yeah, then certainly. But there could be cases where a lot of the times some functions or some of the specifications are written few years ago, they have not changed. The ambience has changed, the environment has changed, and these functions may not be as important or necessary to the end client and they are still high in the cost hierarchy. So you need to match as an example and see whether it is really necessary to move on. So when we talk about upstream, this is just one example of functional specs in upstream. There are various others, as we have seen before, is to think about all these contributions that we could make upstream to finally add value. Here we are talking about some elements in the denominator of cost, reducing the costs, yeah, by looking at the cost hierarchy, as well as the functional need, the satisfaction requirement, whether we actually need that function. Can we enhance it? Can we reduce it? Can we have certain tolerance levels, for example? If you look at function 2, with a very high cost hierarchy, with a very high cost contribution in the hierarchy, can we have some tolerance for function, or can we reduce the type of material that we are handling by reducing its cost? Because as you can see, the customer is not perceiving it as very, very important. Yeah. So this one way to think about how I can add value, not purely in terms of costs, but also in terms of the functions. Ultimately, looking at the equation of V is equal to best satisfaction by lowest cost, how can I contribute on the numerator as well as at the denominator at the same time? Okay, so this is one example of a functional spec. We look at some other examples, downstream value thinking as well. So we look at downstream risk mitigation, risk mitigation to secure supply. I think you also identify that in the poll, that procurement is now getting more and more important, especially given the disruptions that are happening in the industry, given the consolidations, mergers, acquisitions. Today, a small supplier can become big. Some suppliers could go bankrupt, etc., etc., etc. So what you want to do is to secure supply as a priority, right? You want business continuity, and procurement is one of the one of the departments which is absolutely responsible for that. One thing which I think a lot of you must have faced: if everything works smoothly, nobody comes to procurement. Okay, if everything works smoothly, it's their job, they're doing it well, fine. If something goes wrong, immediately there's a gun pointed at procurement. Yeah, immediately something. Hey, what did procurement do? Why is the supplier not providing me this service or product? Right. So, and that's where you immediately have a focus on risk at the company, because somehow there's business which has been disrupted. Yeah, business continuity is not happening. So that's where it's important. And then you have all these different types of levers to use to secure supply. Yeah, in the end. Then there are others, which is blended scorecard function across functions. So not only on key KPIs like cost, quality, cost, delivery, QCD kind of an approach, but also having scorecards which could be across functions. Yeah, and we will see that in our poll in the next slide. Getting feedback from suppliers on your company could also be a good value add that you can show to your internal customers, right? You could, a lot of the times when we have CRM, you have customer relationship management. Clients on your sales side, they're getting feedback from your clients. Yeah, how is the company performing, and etc., etc. But many of the clients that I work with, they don't have a systematic approach of getting feedback from their suppliers. Yeah, and I think it is an important part, because you can showcase then to your internal client that we are having a good feedback system, and that is also a value add. It's a non-financial value add. It's to say, we have this feedback, we need to improve our performance based on the feedback, and so on and so forth. Okay, it's like a 360-degree feedback that you have typically for an individual in a company. Yeah. Then pushing for integrative product and service solutions within suppliers. So some suppliers are vertically integrated by providing a product and service as a solution, as a combination. You could start working with these kind of suppliers. Early supplier involvement, especially if you have key suppliers or strategic suppliers. So like you have early procurement involvement in the design phase, you could have early supplier involvement as well. You could also set up a supplier and customer relationship. Okay, so you have, let's say you have an end customer, and the end customer many times wouldn't come to you as a provider, but would go to your supplier. So a tier 2 for the end customer. You would go to your supplier directly for certain solutions, right? So when you establish this end customer versus supplier relationship, that also can be a fantastic value add to the company. And this needs to be again communicated. Not much of a financial indicator that you can put in place. And this is precisely contributing all these to the numerator that we are talking about, these elements, in terms of getting satisfaction to the end customer. Okay, so these are some examples. So having got an idea of this now, we'll try to look at some of the classical, let's say, classical non-financial KPIs that you would like to see in your particular example. So I'm just going to open up a short survey again for you to answer. Okay, hold on 1 second. Okay, so I go back. Okay, I think I'm facing the same issue. Silmara, you want to look at going back and just 1 second. I'm just going to open a quick survey. I'll just look at the questions meanwhile. If okay, so somebody has. I'm just looking at a comment. Okay, hold on. Oh yeah, okay. So this was a comment. We say as I said, if everything goes well, then nothing happens to procurement. If something goes wrong, procurement comes. But at the same time, somebody mentioned that if everything goes well, then there's congratulations to the operations or the commercial department, and not much to procurement. Yeah, unfortunately, this is the case. But as I said, this is changing, and as you can mention it, and as you have mentioned as well, this is changing because procurement is being perceived more and more as value-added question. These are all the elements that you could do, you could work on to provide your value add, and that is going to change procurement perception indeed. Yeah. So you're right in saying that many times business doesn't congratulate procurement for its smooth functioning, but if there's an issue, they come back. But this is changing as well, and precisely for some of the elements where you have a value add across different phases of the project. Okay, good. Hold on, just 1 second. I think I'm going to open the survey again. Okay, this is okay, done. Okay, all right. Okay, so this is another question. Now we looked at the upstream and downstream contributions. So what are the different non-financial KPIs you would consider? Again, no right or wrong answer, but think about the different non-financial KPIs that you'd put in terms of adding value add for procurement, let's say. Okay, I'll give you a minute again to work on this one. Okay, good. Don't forget to click on submit. Okay. Okay, I'll give you 15 seconds more. Okay. Okay, getting more and more answers now. Okay, good. All right, I'm going to share the results with you as well, yeah, eventually. All right, 5 seconds. Click on submit if you're chosen. Again, you have some options. All right, great. Okay, good. I'm going to end the voting now, share the results. So you can see on the screen, some of the, again, let's say non-financial KPIs that you put in place. So largely you can see external innovations, and you're right when you mentioned this is, as I mentioned, getting external innovations, the innovation hub moving from a classical R&D, research and development department, towards procurement, because procurement has a lot of access to external innovation. Yeah, and you could be the first people to have access to when you're visiting your suppliers, when you're visiting different fairs, trades, and so on and so forth. You have quick access to external innovation that you can pull inside very quickly, which also gives an outside in view of innovation to the company, right? So we'll look at some of these as well. Hold on one second. Okay, sorry, moving back. Okay, so as an example, we have seen some of the non-financial value add that you can do. How do I track innovation? How much of innovation are you getting from your suppliers? And that is, again, procurement responsibility. So that could be one of the non-financial KPIs you could put in place. I've seen some companies already do that to track innovation that is being brought in by procurement. And sometimes this is not a direct financial, let's say, a contribution to the denominator. It is more about the contribution to the satisfaction that you could get to the internal customer, thus adding value anyway. Okay, so you can see here the first line, some of the examples are contribution from external or supplier access to innovative technologies, better quality, improved service offerings, etc. Establishing customer of choice relationship with suppliers. So that is also one of the key elements to show your internal client that for your supplier, you are a customer of choice. Okay, we have seen many cases before. I'll give you one example, which I remember in 2004. I think there was a big tsunami in Asia, and there you had, or if you look at the Japanese example, you had sometime an earthquake in Japan where there was a lot of disruption in the automotive industry, right? In such cases, what happens is suppliers are reduced to limited production capacity, right? And they have to choose customers eventually. Yeah, they have to choose customers eventually. So if you have 10 customers and they have a capacity only to satisfy 3, 4, or 5, they need to choose and drop out the 5, yeah, which are remaining. So if you as procurement can establish that strong relationship with your suppliers and become the customer of choice, that is already a great value add for the company. Yeah, this is not a purely financial savings related KPI that you can put, but already that gives a good value to the end. I mean, if you communicate it, it already is giving a good value perception of procurement as a let's say as a department that can bring in the customer of choice approach for the suppliers. Okay, then there are some other non-financial KPIs where you have a social contribution through preferential buying. So a lot of the companies are doing this now, where as a part of the corporate social responsibility, procurement is having some small and medium scale entrepreneurs or small and medium scale suppliers, yeah, where they place certain percentage of the purchase to these suppliers to encourage them to grow. Okay, which is a part of the social contribution. Again, it's a value add to the company as such. At the same time, it provides you a backup or a plan B to develop these kind of suppliers. Okay, and for these suppliers, it's very critical to grow volumes because they are new, they are small, or let's say very medium scale towards the lower end of the medium scale supplier. So they are looking for volumes. And as procurement, when you place orders to them as a part of your quota allocation, let's say backup orders, you're already contributing for their expansion, as well as you can put across the message that it's a social contribution as well. Okay, supplier buybacks again is one of these key contributors that procurement can do. So this is largely involved in negotiation as well, as a part of negotiation, where you have certain stock, let's say, which is unused, or you have certain hours of service that are unused and the supplier buys back. Yeah, so you could have these negotiations that the supplier buys back. I saw somebody also clicking on the poll as suppliers as customers. Yeah, there was one of these options in the non-financial KPIs, where you have suppliers as customers. Okay, and some of the companies who have these specific kind of products are doing a conscious effort to convert their suppliers to customers, which locks them in the more strategic, more closer partnership mode. Yeah, to have. You need to think through before doing that, obviously, but more and more companies are doing it. They can expand their supplier base, they can expand their customer base, and then as a supplier, you automatically also are getting a customer of supplier of choice, and the customer gets a customer of choice relationship. So it's more partnership oriented as well, right? So these are all the elements, just some examples in where procurement can think about adding value, not only purely in terms of cost, as you can see, but a much larger view of creating value for the company. Okay, with all these different types of action plans that we have seen. Okay, good. So just to make a quick summary and then link all these elements that we have seen. We look at the basic definition. We know that now as value as the function of satisfaction versus cost. Largely, we are working on reducing costs as procurement. We are cutting costs, so we reduce the denominator and thus increase value. But at the same time, all these non-financial KPIs that we have seen and different types of action plans that you can put in place, where you're contributing largely to getting satisfaction to the client. It could be through various means. It could be through quality, providing quality product, providing the right place, right time, right, etc., etc. Innovation, fantastic customer of choice, relationship with the supplier, etc., etc. All these is contributing to the numerator here, yeah, and thus adding value as well. So when we talk about value, procurement moves slowly away from purely a cost, let's say, purely a perception of a cost-saving department to a more value-creating department. Yeah, that's the idea, effectively. Okay. So just to make a quick summary, what we have seen so far is what is value. Yeah. So we understand what is the definition of value and what goes on the top and what goes at the numerator and what goes at the denominator, effectively, and different components that can come in. We also now understand the upstream and downstream contribution. Upstream, which has the higher potential of higher savings potential. Downstream, slightly lower, but there are different levers to do that. Upstream, we have seen levers like functional specification as an example, value engineering, redesign to cost, etc., etc. Whereas downstream, it's more classical about cost breakdown, TCO, let's say total cost of ownership, which slightly starts moving towards the upstream, negotiation and RFQ and so on and so forth, which is more downstream contribution. And whenever we are contributing all this keeping in mind, how is it impacting the bottom line of the company? So largely either it is in a cost of goods sold, or it is in a cost of operating expenses, or it is contributing to sales, yeah, largely, in terms of as a revenue enabler. So you can see all these elements together now. Then we have tracking of financial and non-financial. The financial ones are very classic. It's again price, price, and price. But you have seen a variety of non-financial KPIs where procurement can add huge value to the internal and external stakeholder. Okay. And then finally, we have all these elements to be communicated to the stakeholders, yeah, and mentioning the top line and the bottom line impact that your actions as procurement can have on the value, effectively. Okay, so overall, as I said right in the beginning, it is moving procurement from a purely transactional and a savings department to a more partner mode, or let's say working as a core contributor in the strategy and ecosystem of the company. Okay, so and this kind of value thinking as to each action that I do, what kind of value is going to add at the numerator, at the denominator, and so on. And all these actions are effectively a mode or a method to transform the perception of procurement completely. And as you mentioned, somebody mentioned in the comment, when things go well, then procurement is not very much applauded. But these kind of approaches are done now to change that very perception. Yeah, and then ultimately procurement being a key contributor to the value of the company. Okay. Good, great. So we have finished on time. I'll leave the floor open to questions if you may have. Okay. Please, you have the chat section open. Okay, so I'm just going to look at the chat section. If you have any questions or comments even to make, if you have experience doing such kind of activities already, I'm sure some of you have already done this. You could mention it in the comment, or if you have any specific question, please do so. Okay, I'll give a few minutes for you to digest and come up with questions if you may have. Okay. Okay, so there's a couple, just hold on. I'm just going to read through at the end of the middle. At the end or middle of a value add journey, using all the tools as we can track information. So yeah, so I have a question here which is that I'm just going to it's a long question, but I'm going to rephrase it, paraphrase it a bit. Effectively saying that if you identify a good outsource supplier, yeah, let's say it's a big supplier, the idea is okay, this is about IT specifically. So if you have identified a supplier who can do all the innovation and et cetera, or, you know, for a specific category, working with a big supplier, can you show this as a, let's say, a societally partner relationship, more as a partner and not purely a supplier relationship, right? So yeah, so of course, the idea here is once you have these kind of suppliers, like from my previous experience, I can tell you we had around 50 or 60 suppliers out of 6,000, so roughly 1%, who we were treating as our partners. Okay, who are treating as our partners. So complete lock-in in terms of we were sharing a lot of information. Of course, we used to delineate our strategic information and share all the rest of the information to the suppliers. The supplier did the same. So we had forecasts, we had business insights, early phase development involvement, and so on and so forth. And the supplier used to do the same in terms of innovation, in terms of so purely in terms of setting up this kind of relationship. I think it's a good idea if you have a certain strong relationship with a smaller group of suppliers, because when we talk about supplier relationship management, as you said, there's a lot of time and effort in it. So if you have a huge base of suppliers, typically you would have in many companies I have seen, typically you would have 1 or even less than 1% of the suppliers who you're actually implementing supplier relationship management with. Yeah, otherwise it's impossible to manage this huge group of suppliers. So as I said before, we had 6,000 suppliers and we had 60 roughly as our key partners. Yeah, and there was an conscious effort to manage these suppliers systematically through an SRM program in the company. So yes, it is quite beneficial, and then you need to have a good agreement of how you're going to share the benefits from the supplier side as well as as well as your side. But it can work really well rather than a purely client-supplier relationship. The partner relationship works much better. Of course, consider that there is a lot of significant amount of time and effort that gets into this. So you should be having the right kind of suppliers who are selected, who are a good strategic fit, cultural fit, technical fit, etc. to your company. Okay. Then I have a question here. In your opinion, procurement area is a back office or a front office? Okay, this is a question whether it's a back office or a front. Let me get this right. When you say back office, you're talking about mostly considering the transactional work. Is that right? Or I'm just trying to get the back office versus front office perspective right. Whereas, of course, or maybe I can answer purely assuming that when you talk about back office, we're talking about some of the work that I mentioned before of PO processing and savings and purely as a support pillar to some of the business areas, right? Whereas front office is more moving towards a core contributor. Yeah. This is or directly in touch with the final customers and so on and so forth. And yes, procurement has to play a role of both. In fact, we cannot completely eliminate some of the tasks that procurement has been done. With more and more automation in companies, this work of back office treatment of POs and invoices and et cetera, is already being reduced, eliminated. Today, we don't have 100% elimination of this area. So procurement at some point of time will still be involved in some of the very transactional and operational work, but more and more contribution is coming more towards the front end or working upstream, as I said, right? In terms of a partnership with the internal stakeholder. Procurement is also participating in the boardrooms of companies, making decisions, yeah, with the other departments. So that is a fantastic progress already from being a very transactional or back office kind of a work to more of a front office kind of a work, let's say. Okay, so yes, it's both. Let's say it still has to do some tasks which are transactional, but lesser and lesser now, and moving more towards upstream or a value-added contributor eventually. Okay. All right. Any more questions? So I'll just wait for a minute. Meanwhile, I'll just give you the quick reminder on when you leave the webinar, you'll have a short survey to fill in, less than a minute of your time. Give us a feedback. And then, of course, we have an EIPM conference later on in 2020 on the 26th, 27th of March. So it's on 5th generation purchasing. And you could save the date if you're available. It'll be fantastic to receive you on this date. Okay. Let me go back to the question. All right, no more. Oh, thank you very much for your comments there. So I'm getting some comments for thanking for this presentation. Thanks to you again for sparing your time and attending. I hope this 1 hour was useful effectively. Okay. All right, so no more questions. I'm going to thank you all again. Have a good day or evening, whichever part of the world you are, and wish you the best. All right. Thank you very much.